Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Humanities Forum. My name is Ian Bernhoft. I'm the coordinator of the forum, which is an initiative of the Humanities program at Providence College that offers the PC community the opportunity to learn from leading scholars, professionals, journalists, academics from around the country and around the world. So it's for you students and for you faculty, it's an opportunity to engage in the life of the mind outside of class, right? To deepen our appreciation for the humanities, to explore diverse perspectives. For those of you who might be new here or who might need a reminder of our format, the way it works is we'll hear first from our guest speaker, and we always wrap up right around 4:45, so that we usually leave about 20 to 25 minutes for Q&A at the end. And you students, on your shoulders falls the burden of asking the first question. So prepare accordingly. Normally I have to scold everybody to put away their electronics, but it looks like you all have done a beautiful job of putting away your electronics. So well done. You're present. You're in the room. When we get to the Q&A, make sure just to wait for the microphone to come to you, and then make sure to introduce yourself and your field or your major. And then the last thing I have to remember to remind you about is that afterwards there's always a really nice reception down the hall in the great room. Please join us. There's delicious food and equally delicious conversation. So with that, I'm going to pass this microphone over to my colleague, Dr. Raymond Hain, who will introduce today's guest.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce today's special event. This afternoon, the Humanities Forum hosts the annual St. Thomas Aquinas Lecture of the Humanities Program. This is made possible by a generous benefactor of the program who has a deep love for St. Thomas. And this annual lecture exists to promote and continue the tradition of intellectual reflection rooted in St. Thomas's thought. St. Thomas Aquinas went home to our Lord 750 years ago, and since then his philosophical and theological reflection has played a special and significant role in the thought of the Catholic Church and increasingly throughout the world and across numerous academic disciplines. As a Dominican friar, he's also an exemplary model and champion of the intellectual life for us here at Providence College. It should therefore be no surprise, I think, that the Humanities Program considers St. Thomas one of its special patrons. And it's an honor for us each year to contribute to the ongoing reflection on his contributions to the Church and to our world. Our lecturer this year is Professor John O'Callaghan, Associate Professor of Philosophy and Director Emeritus of the Jacques Maritain Center at the University of Notre Dame. He was educated at St. Norbert College, where he majored in physics and mathematics, and the University of Notre Dame, where he studied philosophy, writing on the philosophical work of Thomas Aquinas, and receiving his PhD in 1996. He's taught at Creighton University, the University of Portland, and the University of Notre Dame. He's written or edited a number of books and articles in the area of Thomistic studies, including Thomist Realism and the Linguistic Turn from 2003, and Recovering Nature with Thomas Hibbs in 1999. He's the 2013 past president of the American Catholic Philosophical Association and is a permanent member of the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas, appointed by Pope Benedict XVI. He's a recipient of the Aquinas Medal from the University of Dallas and is currently working on Misericordia, a book that I and many others are eagerly awaiting. Professor O'Callaghan is a remarkable example of the power and continued relevance of the thought of St. Thomas. I know this from personal experience. I was a graduate student at Notre Dame when he returned as a professor in the early 2000s. As a result of his encouragement, I spent a great deal of time in the Jacques Maritain Center, where I met and befriended the great Thomist scholar Ralph McInerney, and met Rob Miner for the first time, sitting here in the front rows. Professor O'Callaghan, without my realizing it at the time, connected me to a deep and lasting intellectual heritage that played a profoundly formative influence in my academic development. Also, those of you who know me know, too, that I can't resist organizing something here or there most of the time, usually too much of the time, I'm afraid. And as a graduate student one semester, I brought together my friends to read Professor O'Callaghan's book, Thomist Realism and the Linguistic Turn. It was an extraordinary example of a deep understanding of the Thomistic tradition, the text of St. Thomas, and robust engagement with the problems and people of today. It showed me what it could mean to represent a living Thomistic tradition and to continue that tradition. John, thank you for showing us, myself, and many others, how to remain true to the roots of our tradition and to continue it. We owe you our profound thanks. Professor O'Callaghan's topic this afternoon is No Mercy from a Distance, Aquinas on Compassion and Natural Friendship. Please join me in welcoming him to Providence College.
Thank you, Raymond. Can everyone hear? Great. It's really wonderful to come here to Providence because there are so many people both from Notre Dame and elsewhere that I have met over the years and see so many familiar faces. And it's particularly pleasing to me to be back here with Father Brophy, who was an undergraduate at Notre Dame, and Rob Miner, who was in graduate school with me, and Raymond, who was a graduate student. And I must say, that seminar that he organized on my book, I was a little afraid of doing it because you worry when it's all graduate students, which is what it was, that a question will be raised and you're sitting at the end of the table because it's your book and everybody just looks over, right? Waiting for the oracle or something like that. But they were all very, very excellent students, and it was a marvelous seminar, and I was very proud and honored to have that happen. So thank you, Raymond. Also, when Ian asked me to give this lecture, the Aquinas lecture, at one point he wrote me and he said, well, now it is the Aquinas lecture, so it would be good if you could maybe try to talk about Thomas Aquinas and the thought of Thomas Aquinas. And I think I responded, well, I'll see if I can try to do that. You'd be if it was on somebody else than Aquinas, then you'd have to worry well, gee, what has he got to say about that? Although my wife would probably say he's got something to say about everything. So maybe I could do that. Okay. In our culture, mercy is often thought of as consisting of an act of forgiveness of some offense, whether civic or personal, that reduces or eliminates the punishment due for that offense. In the case of personal offense, perhaps it releases the offender from the punishment of being alienated from a friend or family member. The public discussion of it is dominated by questions about how it seems to be opposed to justice. However, that sense of mercy as forgiveness of punishment due an offense is hard to square with other uses of the term that suggest something more like assistance to those in need, as in the religious notion of works of mercy directed to the poor and suffering. Feed the hungry, clothe the naked, heal the sick, instruct the ignorant. Originally among the opera misericordiae, in our day, these acts of mercy seem to have been transformed into strict duties of justice that are the responsibility of the state, about which, sadly, our society seems all too unjust in various places and times. In earlier times, these acts were conceived of not as acts of justice, but the acts of a responsible Christian, infused with caritas and works of the church as the communal body of Christ, giving to others as Christ has given to us. Burying the dead. Well, that's a health regulation now. But what of visiting the imprisoned? At least this seems in our day somewhat alien to a strict matter of justice. It's an act of assistance for those who suffer, provided we recognize imprisonment, however just it may be as punishment, as a form of suffering. And if it counts as a merciful act, it seems it's merciful in a way very different from mercy understood as reducing the amount of punishment that is due for an offense. Another so-called work of mercy is to forgive offenses. and it was traditionally associated with comforting the afflicted and bearing wrongs patiently. Is that what we think of when we think of a judge or governor for giving a punishment? That is, something akin to comforting the afflicted and bearing wrongs patiently. However, the contemporary sense of mercy associated with punishment is also hard to square with the sense that mercy requires compassion. That is, suffering with another. A compassion that is not necessarily required by forgiveness of just punishment, and may even be at odds with justice. Out of compassion, one visits the imprisoned and does not thereby forgive or reduce the punishment. One visits the imprisoned even as the state continues to punish the offender to the full extent of the law. By doing so, one goes to the prison and shares in the punishment for a little while, alleviating some of the suffering of the prisoner, suffering that is related to the punishment even if not strictly part of it. Such aspects of imprisonment as loneliness and feelings of abandonment, for example. This is all by way of introducing my discussion of Thomas Aquinas in this Aquinas lecture at Providence College, a lecture I am deeply honored to deliver. I want to talk about how Aquinas provides an account of mercy that helps us understand the ways in which it differs from the forgiveness that seems at odds with justice. A mercy, according to Aquinas, that necessarily involves compassion for those who suffer. We will see that the foundation for this understanding of mercy is that such compassion is grounded in natural human friendship. But the idea of natural human friendship is perhaps even more at odds with our modern sensibilities than that mercy might not be a matter of forgiveness, of punishment. A sensibility in which we typically think that while justice binds us to others, we are nonetheless free to choose our friends as we like. As a matter of justice, there are things I am not free to do to you. And there may be things I should or must do for you, but I don't need to be your friend. If I choose, you might as well be a stranger I just happen across on the road. However, if Aquinas is correct, we do not have such freedom to treat others as strangers on the road. Indeed, if Aquinas is right about natural friendship, we are more bound to one another by mercy than we are by the justice that keeps us at a distance from one another. If equality and blind justice, in a sense, keep us at a distance from one another, for Aquinas, there is no mercy from a distance. Let me begin. In the trial scene of Act 4 of The Merchant of Venice, Shakespeare places in the mouth of Portia, disguised as a man of the law, a beautiful soliloquy on mercy. Addressing the Jewish moneylender Shylock, she says, "The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesseth him that gives and him that takes. 'Tis mightiest in the mightiest. It becomes the throned monarch better than his crown. His scepter shows the force of temporal power, the attribute to awe, the attribute to awe and majesty, wherein doth sit the dread and fear of kings. But mercy is above this sceptered sway. It is enthroned in the hearts of kings. It is an attribute to God himself. And earthly power doth then show like as God's, when mercy seasons justice. Therefore, Jew, though justice be thy plea, consider this, that in the course of justice, none of us should see salvation. We do pray for mercy. And that same prayer doth teach us all to render the deeds of mercy. I have spoke thus much to mitigate the justice of thy plea." The first thing we notice in the soliloquy is that mercy is played off of justice, as if opposed to it. Mercy seasons justice. It mitigates or limits what justice demands. In the hardened face of justice, it is blessed and blesses. In a monarch, it sits higher even than his crown because it is something divine. And the monarch is an image of God when he expresses mercy despite what his justice might demand. Justice, by contrast, is implicitly associated with the monarch's scepter, the symbol of his temporal power and majesty. Mercy sits above this sceptered sway. If we think for a moment about the reference to the image of God, it tacitly suggests that divine mercy holds back the full force and power of divine justice from having its way with us sinners in the hands of an angry God. And that fits very well with our contemporary sense of mercy, holding back the full force of just punishment for those malefactors who have offended against us and our law. And yet, there is one present in the trial whose heart is not pierced by the beauty of godlike mercy. Shylock's heart. He is unmoved. He responds immediately, "My deeds upon my head, I crave the law, the penalty and forfeit of my bond." He wants the law of Venice, its justice. Much of the play to that point had set up the scene by pointing out in numerous exchanges that if the Duke does not enforce the bond against Antonio, Venice's credit in the world will be destroyed and the city come to ruin. The justice of the law sustains the society, its wealth and prosperity in the civilized world. In fact, Bassanio, one of Antonio's friends, urges the Duke, who stands in judgment, "I beseech you, rest once the law to your authority. Do a great thing, do a little wrong, and curb this cruel devil of his will." But Portia responds, "It must not be. There is no power in Venice can alter a decree established. 'Twill be recorded for a precedent, and many an error by the same example will rush into the state. It cannot be. The only person who can justly release Antonio from the bond is the one who holds it, not even the Duke, who by his scepter and worldly power is the guarantor of Venetian justice, can release the bond freely entered into by foolish and proud Antonio. The law is Shylock's crown, the crown of justice, not mercy. In fact, we are reminded by Shylock's response about wanting the law of his earlier, perhaps even more beautiful soliloquy than Portia's. Asked what he will do with Antonio's pound of flesh, Shylock responds, "To bait fish withal, if it will feed nothing else. It will feed my revenge. He hath disgraced me and hindered me 500,000, laughed at my losses, mocked at my gains, scorned my nation, thwarted my bargains, cooled my friends, heated mine enemies. And what's his reason? I'm a Jew. Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions? Fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer, as a Christian is. If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? If we are like you and the rest, we will resemble you in that. If a Jew wrong a Christian, what is his humility? Revenge. If a Christian wrong a Jew, what should his sufferance be by Christian example? Why, revenge. The villainy you teach me, I will execute, and it shall go hard, but I will better the instruction. What is Shylock's argument? Justice. Equality before the law. I am like you. and yet at every turn you abuse, mock, cheat, and persecute me and mine. There is no social equality for the Jews of Venice, no friendship. There is no mercy shown them. All they have is the law. It is that justice that he will wield like a scepter to have his vengeance for the lack of mercy shown him and his. Is not justice as divine as mercy? Is not justice beautiful to those who are abused mercilessly? And isn't Portia's appeal now for godlike mercy to be given to Antonio rather arbitrary in abandoning godlike justice? The Merchant of Venice, in classical terms, is traditionally classed among Shakespeare's comedies because its purported protagonist, the merchant Antonio, comes to a good end, being released from the bond by a loophole in it that Shylock did not foresee. The bond says pound of flesh, but it says nothing about blood. So he must remove a pound of flesh without spilling any of Antonio's blood, lest he be accused of conspiring to take the life of a Venetian citizen for which the punishment is death. It's an ironic play on Jewish kashrut, in which any meat that is consumed must be bloodless. So it turns out that the justice of the law is what saves Antonio, not mercy. And while Antonio prospers by the loophole, his apparent antagonist, Shylock, comes to a bad end, breaking his bond to avoid his death, forfeiting half his goods, and being compelled to abandon his Jewish faith and friends as he is compelled to become a Christian. It is little known, however, that Shakespeare's actual title for the play, under which he registered it legally for a license to be performed on stage, was The Merchant of Venice or The Jew of Venice. The actual title is thus much more ambiguous and lends itself to the possibility of a more ambiguous and ironic interpretation of the play as a tragedy, in which Shylock is the protagonist who comes to a bad end, and Antonio the antagonist who comes to a good end. The reason he does so is precisely because of the absence in Venice, of truly godlike mercy. Not the mercy of forgiveness, but the mercy of natural friendship. In our own culture, we see mercy and justice at loggerheads, just as in the play. There are those who defend the rights of justice and those who advocate for mercy. We enact laws that have a very narrow range of punishment allowed for the guilty, where the guidelines for determining just what punishment should be imposed are almost algorithmic, specifying to every jot and tittle which circumstances they will take account of and which they won't, leaving very little room for judgment. We will have our pound of flesh, so we try to eliminate any possibility of a loophole through which injustice may escape. Certainly, little leeway is allowed for compassion on the part of a judge in imposing the sentence. Justice must be blind if it is to be justice at all. The vicious circle of justice and mercy, where justice and mercy are played off of one another as opposed, is an ancient one, much older than the plays of Elizabethan England, or the otherwise competing modern impulses of modern thought. Consider this objection that Aquinas poses to himself in discussing whether mercy can be attributed to God. Mercy is a relaxation of justice, but God cannot forgive that which pertains to his justice. For it is said in 2 Timothy that he cannot deny himself. But, Aquinas objects, he would deny himself if he denied his words. Therefore, mercy is not appropriate to God. The conflict goes back even further to ancient Rome. If you've read or will have the opportunity to read, which I would recommend, Seneca's letter to Nero called De Clementia, Portia's soliloquy is a nearly perfect poetic summary of the great Stoic's thought on what the character of a ruler ought to be in punishing. Seneca urges Nero to rein in his desire to enact vengeance upon rebellious citizens. a vengeance that gives vent to his rage. Seneca argues that there is more power in clemency than there is in punishment. For any man can take a life, but only a ruler like a god can give a life that is not deserved. This insight of Seneca's is reflected 2 millennia later in Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List. When Schindler, drinking with the camp commandant Amon Goth on his porch overlooking the concentration camp, persuades Goth to refrain from his vicious cruelty because it shows greater power to refrain. Goth relents for a few days, but his intemperance, cruelty, and rage overwhelm him eventually, and he returns to randomly shooting prisoners from that porch. So Seneca, inspiring both Shakespeare and Spielberg, compares the mercy of clemency to a godlike virtue, rather than the base intemperance of rage and cruelty. Even before Seneca, Cicero, trying to win the mercy of Julius Caesar for Ligarius, one of the rebels in the Civil War whom Caesar had banished, flatters Caesar, reminding him of his well-known mercy. He flatters Caesar's vanity that he is known for not enacting vengeance upon his enemies. He is rather praised far and wide for his mercy. Of course, here in the case of Caesar, that praise of his mercy turns out to be historically ironic. Among his assassins, both Cassius and Brutus had been the subject of that very mercy of Caesar. Caesar magnanimously forgave them, showed them mercy despite their parts in the Civil War, but they would not be so merciful to him. The reason they killed him was his growing imperial and, they thought, tyrannical pretensions, among which was the condescension of extending mercy to malefactors, the mercy that rightly belongs only to the Senate and people of Rome. Caesar's mercy was an abuse of Rome's justice and at odds with it, even if Cassius and Brutus had themselves benefited from it. Caesar interfecendus est. Caesar must be killed. Suppose we turn the page now and consider more fully the thought of Aquinas on mercy, to reflect upon this conflict between justice and mercy and perhaps see a way through it. However, to do so, I have to distinguish 2 Latin words, clementia and misericordia. These words were used interchangeably and ambiguously in classical Latin in the time of Cicero. When Cicero praised Caesar for his well-known mercy, he used the term misericordia for the forgiveness he urges upon Caesar. The standard translation of misericordia into English is mercy. Hail, Holy Queen, Mother of Mercy. Salve Regina, vita de dulcedo et spes nostra. Salve Regina, Mater Misericordiae. Is a term of, the standard translation is mercy. At other times in Cicero's work, however, misericordia is a term of abuse, signifying something different from an act of limiting punishment, signifying rather a passion that Cicero is in a quasi-stoic fashion treats as a vice of the mind, a kind of tender-heartedness that is equally a soft-headedness and impediment to acting virtuously. Writing 100 years later in the letter to Nero, Seneca will use clementia for forgiveness, the kind of forgiveness that Cicero had urged upon Caesar with the term misericordia. Now, however, he explicitly distinguishes such forgiveness from misericordia, which he treats as a vice and compares to the, quote, weeping of wretched and old women around the prison gates, end of quote. He is urging clementia upon Nero, not, God forbid, misericordia. So where in Cicero 2 distinct and opposed phenomena fell under the same word, by the time of Seneca, 2 different words are being employed for the distinct phenomena. Still, Seneca's clementia is often translated into English as mercy. The reason I mention these linguistic facts is that I've argued elsewhere that the mercy that Portia praises as divine in The Merchant of Venice is in fact Stoic clementia, not Christian misericordia. If that is correct, then what she praises does not bear upon the good of the one who receives forgiveness. It bears upon and increases the good of the one who extends it. Thus the statement in the soliloquy, "'Tis mightiest in the mightiest, it becomes the throned monarch better than his crown." For Seneca and the Stoics, clemencia is a form of temperance, improving the character of the one who punishes, not the one who is punished. It improves the one who punishes by reining in the passions of rage and cruelty. Aquinas, of course, inherits the two Latin words over 1,000 years later, and they remain distinct for him as they were for Seneca, even though, as we will see, his treatment of misericordia is very different from Seneca's abuse. According to Aquinas, clemencia is indeed a virtue of forgiveness that remits or lessens punishment. He treats it under the cardinal virtue of temperance, as Seneca had considered it. Indeed, Aquinas' discussion is heavily influenced by his knowledge of both Cicero and Seneca. Clemencia for Aquinas is a form of temperance because it reins in rage and tempers the pleasure of vengeance that would otherwise lead to cruelty. Clemencia bears upon the good of the one who punishes. It may well have a good effect upon the one who receives it, but that is accidental and beside the point. It might just as easily have a bad effect upon the one who receives it, making him or her more likely to offend again. And remember, the effect of Caesar's clemency upon Cassius and Brutus made them worse by causing their resentment of Caesar's condescension. It made them into assassins. However, regardless of the consequences, the point is that its nature is to make the one who punishes. Upside down. However, regardless of the consequences, the point is that its nature is to make the one who punishes better because more temperate and less cruel. However, moving on from clemencia, when Aquinas turns to discuss misericordia, we see him distinguish two different forms of misericordia, stemming from two different traditions of thought. The one is primarily Greek, stemming from Aristotle's treatment of pity in the Rhetoric and the Poetics, while the other is primarily scriptural and driven by the Christian tradition. While Aquinas accepts the Roman and Stoic tradition of thought on forgiveness of punishment, expressed by clemencia, he rejects that tradition's thought on misericordia as a passion. That is, the Stoic tradition that treats it as an illness or vice of the mind. Aquinas argues that misericordia is both a passion and, more importantly, a virtue. It is a virtue precisely because, as a passion, it is subject to the rule of reason and will. That it is a passion is taken from its etymology. Misericordia, miser and cor, a miserable or suffering heart. However, a virtue, particularly a moral virtue, is precisely the kind of habit by which the rule of reason and the movement of the will give order to the expression of the passions in our life in service to the human good. So Aquinas gives us a definition of misericordia that he finds in St. Augustine's City of God. Misericordia is heartfelt compassion for those who suffer, by which we are compelled to act on their behalf to alleviate that suffering to the extent possible. The aspect of misericordia as a passion is expressed by the term compassion, or in the Latin compassio, whose etymology is simply suffering with, a notion we will return to later in its relation to natural friendship. The aspect of the virtue is expressed by the compulsion to act, according to reason and will on behalf of those who suffer, action moved by compassion, that is, in light of the suffering with them. As opposed to clemencia, its nature or point as a virtue is to achieve the good of other human beings insofar as they suffer. Thus, the forgiveness of offenses that is among the traditional works of mercy is not the forgiveness of clemencia, that does not bear upon the good of the one who is punished. If forgiveness stems from misericordia rather than clemencia, it has as its point the good of the offender. Because of the element of compassion that is suffering with one who suffers, Aquinas argues that misericordia involves some form of union that in some way recognizes the suffering of another as one's own. This recognition of the suffering of the other as one's own is where we see the bifurcation into the two forms I mentioned. Again, the first form relies heavily upon the Aristotelian tradition of pity, or eleos in the Greek. Aquinas writes that it is a real union with the one who suffers based upon likeness. Aristotle observed how in Greek dramatic tragedies we often feel a kind of pain when we observe a character suffering an undeserved or unjust reversal of fortune from good to bad, where the loss experienced in the reversal is some significant good. He called this pain eleos. Eleos is usually translated with pity in English, although the term pity has unfortunate notes of condescension that Aristotle's Greek does not have. Notice the loss one observes in another has to be in some sense unjust. So eleos will not be felt for those who suffer justly. For example, those who are being justly punished. They deserve it, after all. Aristotle suggests that we should rather rejoice in the suffering of others that is justly deserved. Eleos is reserved for unjust suffering. Eleos also has to involve the loss of some significant good, one's home or property of sufficiently great value, or one's social status, and so on. Thus, for Aristotle, one will not feel eleos for those who have never had significant goods. The bottom rungs of society, the poor and destitute from birth or early on in life. And here is the crucial part of eleos relevant to our discussion. One has to recognize the one who suffers as very much like oneself with respect to the goods of life. This recognition of likeness to oneself is the union achieved whereby one recognizes the good of the other as one's own. It's a parallelism. My goods are the same kinds of things as his goods. I am as subject to the loss of them as he is. The reason for this parallel recognition that we have the same type of goods is because Aristotle believes that eleos causes fear in the one who observes the loss suffered by others. It causes a fear for oneself. Recognizing someone who is very much like oneself, perhaps of the same social class, possessing the same types of significant goods like a home, property, wealth, and status, and seeing how through no fault of his own that other person unjustly loses those goods, one fears that a similar fate could befall oneself. Eleos, or pity, for another very quickly becomes fear for oneself. So the meaning of compassion here, the suffering with, is that of a recognition in fear of joint vulnerability. I suffer a sense of my own vulnerability to possible loss, which constitutes my suffering alongside your actual loss. Aquinas acknowledges this very human phenomenon in this first form of misericordia, explicitly relying at points upon Aristotle's discussion. There's a key difference from Aristotle, however. The eleos, which turns into fear for oneself, does not in Aristotle prompt action. In the case of drama, Greek tragedy, it can't. There's nothing you can do to help Oedipus or Antigone. You can only watch, be moved to pity, and thank God that isn't you. In the courts of law that the rhetoric concerns itself with, the point of discussing eleos is that you need to be trained in your judgments to avoid the pity that the defendant will likely try to raise in your mind in order for you to depart from justice and act out of this pity. That would be our modern dilemma that now pits mercy against justice. Aristotle's point is that you need to be careful that the weeping of the offender's wife and children that the defendant brought to display before you to rouse your pity does not, through eleos and your own fears, affect the justice of your judgment. By contrast, Aquinas thinks this misericordia can in fact be a compelling motive for acting to alleviate suffering in another as an expression of the virtue of misericordia. Because you fear this may happen to you, it is perfectly reasonable for you to act to alleviate the suffering of the other. After all, being like them in your possessions, wealth, social status, this is what you would want from others if you suffered in that way. Here, even in the midst of the Aristotelian influence of Eleas, Aquinas can lay claim to be explicating a biblical theme as well. He's relying upon the biblical injunction to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. If you would want assistance in such a situation, you too should offer it now. If you're familiar with the voluminous work of the contemporary philosopher Martha Nussbaum on pity and compassion, you will recognize this argument as the argument she gives for her alternative account of justice to the otherwise impersonal and bloodless account of justice given by John Rawls and his followers. She too relies heavily upon the Greek tragic background analyzed by Aristotle. What's lacking in her otherwise extraordinary work on the subject is any awareness that Aquinas made that argument about mercy and compassion 800 years ago. The irony is that in her historically embedded analysis, she explicitly skips over the Christian tradition. It goes up to Aristotle and starts again with Adam Smith, including Aquinas, because she thinks it expresses what she calls the anti-compassion tradition in its otherworldliness, not taking seriously the goods of this world that may be lost. Engaging that argument is for another day in that book that I await for just as much as anybody else. Turning now to the second form of misericordia that Aquinas analyzes, he describes it as follows. It is because of a union of affection, which is effected by love. For since the lover thinks of his friend as himself, he thinks of the suffering that belongs to his friend as his own suffering. And so he is sorry about his friend's evil as about his own. Notice, besides the emphasis upon love as a kind of union, the explicit and multiple mentions of friendship. The first form of misericordia, based upon the union of likeness, does not involve friendship. Certainly in the poetic context that Aristotle describes, you can't be friends with Oedipus or Antigone. But even in real life, in the union based upon likeness, you have a house and I have a house. You have a good job and I have a good job. You have a wife and children and I have a wife and children. These similarities are the basis of the likeness, but not friendship. It's a parallelism of goods at stake. I may be pained by your loss of these goods, but your losing them is not suffering for me, except insofar as I suffer fear for myself, that I will lose my house, my job, and my children. If I don't lose them, I will be relieved for myself. But here in this second form of misericordia, expressing a union of love, I cannot be relieved of my suffering so long as you suffer, because it is your suffering that just is my suffering. In this form, I don't fear the loss of my house, my job, my wife, or child. I grieve for your actual loss of these things. It is part of my good that you have a home. It is part of my good that you have a job. It is part of my good that you have a wife and children. Your loss of these things, how they harm you, constitutes suffering for me because I love you as a friend. I love you as myself. And here this form of misericordia can be understood in terms of a different, though we oftentimes treat them as if they're the same, a different biblical injunction than the one pertinent to the first form. Here the injunction is the second great commandment. Love your neighbor as yourself. There's another very important difference that Aquinas describes in this form of misericordia that differs from Aristotle's discussion of eleos in the first form. Aristotle's eleos, or pity, was about the undeserved loss of one's goods. However, for Aristotle, if someone suffers the loss of goods justly, then we should rejoice in the suffering of that person rather than have pity on him. By contrast, Aquinas argues that your loss of these goods and many others besides may well be the result of some wrong you have done and justly taken from you, and yet I still grieve for your loss and show misericordia to you. We need to understand that the point of just punishment for Aquinas is not that you experience suffering and pain to balance any suffering and pain you may have caused. That's sadistic vengeance. The point of punishment is to restore to the extent possible order to the goods of persons and society that you have disturbed, including to restore you yourself to that order of goods. Your suffering is not the point of your punishment. It is, however, genuine suffering for you. And while I can and should acknowledge the justice of the punishment, the suffering it causes in you can be the occasion of my suffering with you and my efforts to alleviate that suffering to the extent possible. In short, your suffering just punishment is also an occasion for me to show misericordia to you. This is why it is a work of mercy to visit the imprisoned. The contrast at this point with Aristotle is sharp. Nonetheless, there is in this form of misericordia still a recognizable Aristotelian element as well. Since Aristotle himself had said, as Thomas repeats here, a friend is another self. And the highest form of friendship for Aristotle is a friendship of equals in which one identifies the good of another as one's own. In addition, Aristotle recognized that when one's friend suffers a great loss, like the loss of a child, one grieves with one's friend. The Greek word for that is synalgein, not eleos. And Thomas himself cites that discussion of synalgein in Aristotle for this second form of misericordia. Here you mourn with, you suffer with your friend. You don't fear for yourself. However, Aristotle continues on to make what he thinks is an important point about friendship and synalgein, or grief. It is a point that turns out to be important for the discussion of natural friendship. Aristotle says this tendency to mourn with your friend is actually a reason to have very few friends. Friendship represents a choice for Aristotle. If you choose to have lots of friends, you will spend most of your time mourning, which will inhibit your flourishing. If you limit your friendships to a few chosen friends, well, you won't have much to mourn about, and your life will be better for it. He goes on to associate synalgein, that is, grieving with your friends, as being womanish, much like the Stoics associate misericordia with the weeping of women. So for Aristotle, synalgein is a negative feature of friendship, to be avoided, if possible, by choosing your friends wisely. Not so for Aquinas. Even though in the discussion of this second form of misericordia he refers to Aristotle's discussion of synalgein, he makes no mention of Aristotle's negative appraisal of it. Synalgein is a narrow instance of the broader phenomenon of compassion and is to be praised for its role in the virtue of misericordia. In effect, Thomas's rejoinder to Aristotle is that you can't recognize the good of another as your own in friendship without recognizing their suffering as your own as well. And in stark contrast to Aristotle, Thomas quotes Paul's letter to the Romans. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. It's at this point in conclusion, I am approaching the conclusion, that it is apropos to turn to what I've been promising from the beginning, the role of natural friendship and misericordia of this second form. We've seen it is distinguished by the role of friendship in it, not mere likeness of goods possessed as in the first form. We've also seen that it is related to Aristotle's discussion of friendship, but differs from it in an important respect. The citation of St. Paul, in fact, suggests that weeping is a normal and good feature of this kind of friendship in the face of suffering. Indeed, St. Thomas himself confirms the goodness of weeping for one's friends when commenting on the fact that Christ wept for Lazarus just before he raised him from the dead. Knowing he would raise him from the dead, he still wept for his friend. He says that Christ, by his tears, no biblical scholar in this day and age would rip their clothing, and just pull their hair out by what follows here. He says that Christ, by his tears for the suffering of his friend, is teaching against the Stoics that it is rational and good to weep at the suffering of those whom we love. Scripture says of those around Christ that seeing his tears, they said, "See how much he loved him." How can Christ teach against the Stoics? The explanation for the difference on friendship is what Aquinas recognizes as natural friendship, or friendship by nature, the friendship of any human being that you are born into by being born a human being. This is not friendship you are free to choose. It's a friendship that you are born into and must live up to. The key to understanding this misericordia as giving expression to natural friendship is to be found in the early life of the church in North Africa and later in Milan, and has to do with the central role of compassion. The Latin term compassio appears to have been coined within the Christian community of North Africa in the 2nd or 3rd century. After it was coined, it becomes more and more common in the language of church writers throughout the Roman Empire. Interestingly, compassio is a Latin term never used by a pagan classical author. Never in any classical text that we have available to us. It's only used by Christians. What the term initially gave expression to was the idea that Christians should suffer with one another, particularly under the severe persecutions that took place in North Africa. It's a complicated history, but the key figure for my purposes here is Ambrose of Milan in the 4th century. He both changes the scope of compassion, extending it outside the Christian community, and ties it to misericordia, understood not as forgiveness of punishment, but as assistance to the suffering. In a letter to the wealthy Christians of Milan, Ambrose condemns them for ignoring the plight of the poor, with the excuse that poverty is the will of God, expressing divine justice and condemnation of the poor, a divine punishment. The wealthy Milanese Christians held the prosperity gospel of the time. Ambrose first reminds them that it is not the poor who are condemned in Scripture, but rather the wealthy who hoard the price of grain. And then he does something extraordinary. He writes, "You should not look to what each person deserves. Misericordia is not wont to judge on the basis of merit, but to meet needs, not to examine up as to uprightness, but to help the poor." This is not the mercy of forgiveness that opposes justice. It is not clemencia. It is mercy that has nothing to do with justice and judgment of what is and is not deserved. You should not look to what each person deserves. This is assistance to those in need. And then Ambrose adds something more extraordinary, writing, "Who is it that understands this? The one who is compassionate with the poor, who realizes that he is a companion given to him by nature." Now, misericordia will forever be joined to compassion in the life of the church. And compassion is not sectarian. By nature, Ambrose says, not baptism. Compassion is what binds one to one's suffering friends. It is this discussion of compassion as holding for one's natural companions that Augustine, so impressed with the holiness of Ambrose, as depicted in the Confessions, formalizes in his definition of the city of God, and that 800 years later Aquinas will quote in providing his account of the virtue of misericordia. However, Aquinas applies that definition to both forms of misericordia, the one by likeness and the one by the love of friendship. So we have to recognize that Aquinas is giving expression to two distinct forms of compassion. There's the compassion that involves suffering alongside someone when one recognizes a likeness to oneself in terms of goods possessed and social status. That is not the compassion of natural friendship. It is not a compassion that expresses one's bond with the sufferer, since after one assists, one may walk away. Or one's situation with respect to goods possessed and social status may change such that one no longer recognizes such a likeness, and one will no longer have compassion. On the other hand, the second form of misericordia and compassion that Aquinas discusses does give expression to the bond that cannot be broken, the bond of natural human friendship. Thomas actually describes this bond in response to a quirky objection about friendship for strangers or one's enemies. The objection is that one cannot be friends with strangers or enemies because it would involve displaying deception, since they are not, in fact, one's friends. Aquinas responds, on the contrary, by nature, every human being stands as friend to every other human being with a kind of universal love. As Ecclesiasticus says, every animal loves its kind. That's an unbreakable bond. There's no loophole in it. You either live up to it or you abuse it. But you cannot break it. Again, commenting on the great commandment to love your neighbor as yourself, which I have argued is the biblical injunction relevant to this second form of misericordia and compassion grounded in natural friendship, Aquinas asserts it is grounded in the fact that by nature we are all images of God, and writes, nor does it matter whether we say neighbor or brother, according to 1 John 4:21, or friend, according to Leviticus 19:18, because all these words express the same affinity. It is this unbreakable bond that is at the heart of the tragedy of the Merchant of Venice. Right after Shylock's "Do we not bleed?" soliloquy, Antonio responds, I am as like to call thee so again, to spit on thee again, to spurn thee too. If thou wilt lend this money, lend it not as to thy friends. For when did friendship take a breed for barren metal of his friend? But lend it rather to thine enemy. Shylock says, why look you how you storm? I would be friends with you and have your love. Forget the shames that you have stained me with. Supply your present wants and take no doit of usance for my monies, and you will not hear me. This is a kind of. Admittedly, Shylock is being sarcastic. But it is a sarcasm driven by the expressed hatred of Antonio for him and the larger social character of Venice that recognizes that does not recognize. I'm not sure what I wrote in that. Does not recognize natural friendship to the Jews who reside in its midst. Because they do not recognize natural friendship and compassion, all the Jews have available to them is justice. The tragedy is that while the Venetians praise their stoic mercy, they know no compassion. They know no misericordia. Thank you. Hope we still have time for Q&A.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Sorry, that was a little loud. Do you, so you said like, you emphasize the fact that we have like that compassion and friendship with all people, like regardless of if they're strangers, if they're close. But would you say that we have a deeper like responsibility to care for and to be merciful for those like in our own community, like parish or in our families, stuff like that?
Yeah, and I mean, I make no claim for originality. I just try to channel Aquinas in an original way. he actually raises that, again, as a kind of, issue to be dealt with and to be considered as a kind of objection to the things he says. And he does actually recognize what he would call relations of proximity, right? I mean, this is a natural feature of human life. We're not living everywhere in the world. We can't, right? And so he will say that this universal love and natural friendship is specified by these relations of proximity. And in fact, the Latin for neighbor is proximus. So yes, it has to be natural to us, not just in the sense of the universal scope, but also the way we live as human beings. Because the last thing he wants is what later will become, what Chesterton will criticize as a kind of empty humanitarianism. Right? Chesterton has a poem called The World State, one verse of which is, "Oh, how I love the English with a love so pure and Pringlish, and oh, how I hate the French, who never will be English. It's in the suburban tea parties and gardens where I learned to love mankind and hate my next-door neighbor." And that's kind of pushing at it against a kind of what now goes by the name of cosmopolitanism in political philosophy, right? Sort of universal humanitarian cosmopolitanism. And that Aquinas doesn't want. Right? It's someone you meet. Right? And so if you cry for the awful tragedy of the plane and the helicopter going down, that's a kind of, and can be sentimentalism, and it's at best sympathy, right? But it's not compassion, and it's not misericordia. It's not a bad thing to be moved by that tragedy. But again, it's not an expression of friendship simply to cry because someone on television is suffering. Someone at a distance. That's part of the point of no mercy from a distance. You have to embed yourself in ways in which you can be merciful to those who are suffering around you. A great song from the musical Hair, which I would not recommend that you watch the movie or go to, but it's a great song, and it was on the radio, where the woman who has a child by one of the figures sings, "How can people be so heartless? How can they ignore their friends, especially people who care about justice and who care about suffering and injustice?" Right? She's suffering and being abandoned by this guy. So that's a crucial, important point. Good question.
Thank you. Just a couple points. Just wondering, to further what this gentleman said, there are tendencies amongst maybe humans to make other humans other than themselves, and therefore justify cruelty, perhaps even, when you dehumanize them in maybe the tribal sense or the societal sense. Like you can take examples of different, instances in history where that's the case, and so there's no compassion, there's no sorrow about others' suffering that you have perhaps inflicted yourself, and so the other part is the other thing is forgiveness, in the sense of a power base. If the ruler can forgive, but also exert mercy for a punishment he or she imposed rather, whereas the one on whom that is imposed may have a sense of empowerment if he or she forgives the ruler for imposing that. So kind of assert a certain power in themselves through the act of forgiveness. So and they're not being merciful, they're just forgiving.
Yeah, I mean, there is a sense of forgiveness, which is a kind of reconciliation, right? I have a friend at Notre Dame who works on so-called reconciliation studies. And that's an important aspect of forgiveness, and I actually think it has more to do with the forgiveness, which is a work of mercy, right, rather than what you might call judicial forgiveness. that the work of mercy, which is forgiveness, is about a kind of, again, recognizing this is my friend who has offended me. And I'm not acting like a judge or the governor or the president by saying, oh, well, I forgive you. What I'm trying to do is bring order into what is unavoidable, and that is that we not only are we born friends, we remain friends, whether we like it or not. And so that, I think, that kind of forgiveness is different and remains a work of mercy, not a judicial act. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. O'Keefe.
Professor Deaver, nice to see you.
Yes. I had.
He gave me an award once.
I did. I was a younger man.
Little whippersnapper.
Yes. No. Thank you so much. I had just two things, both of which kind of relate to Christianity in Rome and North Africa. The first one is I'm almost certain that Tertullian of Carthage is the one who uses compassio for the first time.
Or at least it shows up for the first time in the fossil record, right?
Yes,
there's a
exactly.
soft tissue problem about text.
Exactly, and it's in the treatise actually on the resurrection where it's developed, interestingly in relation to the soul's compassion for the body. In terms of the soul's desire that for bodily resurrection. That's like one of the main contexts in which he deploys it multiple times is because soul and body suffer together. And so he deploys this term. Anyway, which is interesting and relates to kind of my first kind of question is the role in which, like for Aquinas is thinking that the incarnation plays for this, especially for the concept of natural friendship. Because, I mean, in that treatise of Tertullian's, he doesn't articulate it exactly like this, but riffing off of the idea of love of one's neighbor, in the incarnation, God becomes neighbor to us. The Word becomes our neighbor, shares our human nature. And so I would wonder kind of how the incarnation shapes Thomas's thought on this in a way. Pushing back either against kind of the Stoics with the weeping Jesus or kind of against the Aristotelian notion. That's the first one. And then the second one also flows out of North Africa insofar as Augustine, towards the end of the City of God, I think it's in book 21, he uses the language of misericordia to describe a group of Christians that he's interested in arguing against. He calls them misericordiae nostri, our merciful ones, who think that God's punishment doesn't go all the way down, right? That all might be saved. Yeah. And he refers to them in this language that seems to echo, on your account, the language that Seneca would like to apply to the merciful ones, to the weeping women who would feel bad about this in some way. And I would be interested in your remarks about how you see kind of Christian prayers for mercy, whether or not they're inflected in the language of clemency or in a plea for misericordia from God, working themselves out eschatologically.
So I'll say something about that, but I'll hesitate to say something about that because I'm not a theologian and I'm not just bragging. But the first one, I mean, the North African stuff is absolutely fascinating. Well, no. The reason you need to go to Milan is because though it looks as though the first appearance of the term, which probably came up in the community and then gets used by Tertullian, he does it on the resurrection, and what he's actually doing there when he does it, he's commenting on the passage of Paul, right? That if we suffer with Christ, we will rise with Christ. And it's an argument for the resurrection, right? Because he says, if we suffer in the body with Christ. Now you have to keep in mind that martyrdom and persecution in North Africa was constant, whereas it kind of went up and down in other provinces of Rome. In North Africa, it was constant. And those are where some of the first great martyrs come from that are in the liturgy. Yeah, yeah. So he uses the term in relation to the resurrection, right? And that's St. Paul saying, that I may make up in my sufferings the sufferings lacking in the body of Christ. And of course, he's not thinking of the body of Christ on the cross, but the church. There's something lacking there in the way in which the church is, and so we need to make that up. So there's that. There's its relationship to the resurrection. But the reason we need to go to Milan is because he also, along with St. Cyprian, uses it in the context of asking the question about what to do with Christians who have, by their actions, removed themselves from the church. So in De Fuga, which is on flight under persecution, he says, we have compassion for them. But then, and he's worried about them being just simply let back into communion, right, without any sort of forgiveness or act of repentance. He says, we have compassion for them. We suffer with them because they are our brothers and sisters. But we cannot have mercy upon them because mercy belongs to God. And St. Cyprian does the same thing with those who have committed adultery. He says, St. Cyprian says, we feel as if our guts are being torn out when this happens. And we suffer with them. But we cannot show them mercy because mercy belongs to God. So there has to be an act of repentance. You can't just say, oh, well, he came back, So what you have there is you have the separation of compassion from mercy. Right? And the mercy typically is kind of judicial forgiveness. But then what Ambrose does, and this is why you have to get out of North Africa column, is one, the use of the term compassion, at least in those two contexts, for Cyprian and Tertullian, was members of the Christian community. Okay? And it's very much contextual. And two, precisely the separation of compassion from mercy. Ambrose extends compassion beyond the Christian community to anyone who suffers, right, as natural friendship, and he ties it to mercy, that it prompts mercy. Who is it that understands this? Those who have compassion for those they recognize as their natural companion, or their companions given by nature. So what you have him doing is bringing together the two notions. But again, now the misericordia is not judicial mercy. This isn't about forgiving the poor. And it's not about the deserving poor versus the undeserving poor. It's about assistance to those in need. And that, in terms of the definition that I quote from Augustine, or Thomas does, that's what he's talking about. I haven't actually looked at the later stuff. I'm glad you brought that up, so I may write you later and try to find it.
I know there's a few hands. I want to give the last question to a student, and then the other hands, we're going to have to head next door.
Thank you so much for that lovely talk. Quick question, and maybe it's a loaded one, so we'll see. Do you think that the supernatural theological virtue of charity is required for someone to show that second form of misericordia and compassio?
I have actually thought a good deal about that. I can say this much about Aquinas. Aquinas, because of his weird view of supernatural, the infused virtues and the infused natural virtues, Aquinas does think that misericordia is a natural virtue, okay? Because he recognizes it in Aristotle. He actually, he says, to an objection that this isn't in Aristotle, he says, yes, it is, and he points to a text in the Ethics. It's a charitable reading of that text in the Ethics, but he clearly wants to say this is a part of a life that can be understood and pursued even apart from the infusion of grace and the infusion of the infused natural virtue of misericordia, because there's only the three theological virtues. The rest of you have infused justice, and you have acquired justice. You have infused temperance, and you have acquired temperance. So that at least is reason for thinking yes, and especially because it's related to natural friendship, right? It isn't something that it's not distinctively Christian in that sense, right? And it would be just as a matter of history and sort of cultural understanding. It's one thing for the works of the church and the theologians of the church to thematize and argue and discuss these virtues. It would be an entirely different thing to say, and because, say, Aristotle, or because Plato, or because Empedocles, or whomever didn't talk about this, there was no compassion in Greece, right? They're giving expression to something that the life of the Christian community is helping them to kind of like zero in on and focus. But, or that in our day that someone living in a country that is by and large not Christian or Jewish or Islamic, well, they can't experience compassion because they don't have a word for it. That's not the point. And so if that's real, which is what it seems to be, then sure, yeah, there's natural virtues of compassion and mercy. They're just not talked much about. Right? They don't sort of bubble up into sort of the texts that we have from those times and places. And it's interesting, I mean, because, you know, Epictetus, very famous text. Because he's saying the passions, you got to keep the passions at bay. You can have preferences for things, but you got to be detached from the passions. And the famous porcelain cup text. Look, if you have a favorite porcelain cup, don't weep, and you lose it, don't get all worked up about that. Remind yourself it's a porcelain cup. Of all the porcelain cups, you shouldn't have that kind of attachment to it. But then the point of that example is to go on and say, and if you have a child and you lose that child, or a wife and you lose that wife, you should remind yourself it's a human being that you lost, a child of. Now, I wanted to make 2 points about that in referencing that. One is, I do actually have friends who think that shows that Epictetus was a sociopath. And when this was said to me, I'm like, well, nobody's going to be reading your stuff 2,000 years later. No, Epictetus was a slave. And if you were a slave, and your wife and your child could be taken at any minute, like happened to so many other slaves, you might actually think a good and appropriate response is, I can't live if I get worked up in that way about these people because this is my life, right? So to be a little bit understanding of Epictetus, right? Some mercy for Epictetus. But that also provides indirect evidence of the reality of the passion of suffering with others, because he wants to guard against it in that particular way, given that particular context. It suggests it's a phenomenon that everybody's familiar with. It's not just Tertullian comes up with this word, and then you're off to the races, because it's in St. Paul, after all, and it's in the Old Testament. In the tender compassion of our God, if you look at the I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but the Greek is like in the guts of our God. Right? This flows out, right? In the tender compassion of our God, the dawn from on high shall break upon us. Lord, come to my assistance. Lord, make haste to help me. Right? All of those words in the Septuagint are eleos, but it's not Attic Greek. It's Koine Greek. And so it means something different there, and it's about coming to assistance, acknowledging my suffering. So last word, going back to Professor Deaver's question about the incarnation. And I could go on forever on this column. God, this sounds so bad for philosophers, God suffers compassion. God does suffer. You can say that against the background of the impassibility of God if you know what you're saying. The passion of Christ is the compassion of God, because God adopts our suffering in Christ and suffers with us. So the incarnation is the expression of misericordia, divine misericordia, where it isn't that the mercy follows the compassion. The compassion comes out of the mercy. And for Thomas, that's actually the ideal. That's why he says compassio is subject to reason and will, because reason and will give expression to suffering with others, not wait to suffer with them and then say, okay, now what do I do? The virtue is, I will suffer with you, and I will help you. Not, I had this reaction, now what do I do? That's not the point. The point is, like Christ, compassion comes from mercy. Mercy doesn't come from compassion.
Please give a thunderous applause to Dr. O'Callahan.